Okay, we're ready for lesson 4, which covers chapter 6 of John, verses 22 through 71. It's called the period of controversy. It's still in that section, section 3, and it's letter D in your material. It's called presented in discourse, 6:22 through 71. Last week we talked about chapter 6, verses 1 through 21, where Jesus fed the 5,000 and then the people tried to make him a king. Jesus sends the disciples away in a boat on the Sea of Galilee while he goes up on a mountain to pray. Later in the night, he walks on the water and gets in the boat with them. The following day, the people seek him out. That's where we'll begin today's lesson. They seek him out and find him, and the remainder of the chapter records the discourse or the sermon, the discussion that takes place when Jesus encounters these people. In terms of geography, Chapter 6, verse 1 says, sometime after this, that this is the beginning of the chapter now, when we're getting ready to have the feeding of the 5,000. Sometime after this, after Jesus went to Jerusalem and returned, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. So that's where we are with feeding the 5,000. And Luke's account gets more specific in chapter 9 and verse 10. He tells us that the feeding of the 5,000 took place in Bethsaida. Now, there were two Bethsaidas. You see the one on the map here, right here. This is Capernaum, of course, on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is Bethsaida here on the northeastern shore. There's another Bethsaida that was located a few miles further north of the Sea of Galilee on the same side here, just up above Bethsaida right there. And not 100% certain where it took place, perhaps leaning a little more toward the Bethsaida here on the sea shore. But again, Jesus sent the disciples ahead of him by boat to cross the Sea of Galilee after having fed the 5,000, and probably in Bethsaida, right in this general area here, is where they would have departed. And he walked on the water and then joined them. The next day, when the people could not find him, they were still in Bethsaida or that area. They got in boats and came to Capernaum and found him there. Verses 22 through 25 and verse 59 clarifies that. Verses 22 through 25 says, the next day, this is after the feeding of the 5,000, after their attempt to make him a king, the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Then for some 30 verses, we have Jesus teaching and interacting with this crowd. At the conclusion of the discourse, we read in verse 59, he said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. So that gives us the geography there. Now for question number 1, we're going to discuss what happened on the following day after Jesus fed the 5,000. Question 1 says, why were the people seeking Jesus? And it refers us to verses 22 through 27. Jesus answers the question in verse 26. Starting in verse 22, it says, the next day the crowd that had stayed on the let me see, I just read that through verse 24, so I won't read that again, where they went looking for him, and they came to Capernaum in search of him in verse 24. We read verse 25. When they found him, they said, Rabbi, when did you get here? Verse 26, Jesus said, very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for the food that spoils, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. These people were not interested in spiritual things. They were not even interested in the fact that Jesus performed miracles. That's quite astonishing to me. Jesus states plainly in verse 26 that they were looking for him not because of the signs he performed, but because they ate the food and had their fill. It seems that they wanted to know that if they followed him around, would he continue to provide for them in that same way. The remainder of the chapter shows that Jesus was not interested in those kinds of followers. Question 2 asks, how does one work the works of God? It refers to chapter 6, verses 28 through 40. He actually answers that question in verse 29, but I'll read the text. It says, then they ask him, what must we do to work? What must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. So they ask him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. These people are thinking Jesus is the prophet spoken of by Moses, and they want to make him a king. And they're envisioning peace and prosperity and a life of ease as this prophet meets their physical needs daily, like the Israelites who were fed miraculously for 40 years in the wilderness. But again, verse 29, Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Of course, Jesus is not talking about physical food. He's talking about spiritual food. He's talking about believing in him, having faith in him, believing in his word, his message, his teaching. Question number 3 says, why did the Jews complain about Jesus? And it refers to verses 41 and 42. Those verses say, at this, when Jesus said all that, what we just read, it says, at this the Jews there began to grumble about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, he whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I came down from heaven? It seems they understood what Jesus meant. And since they knew his parents, they ridiculed the idea that he came down from heaven. That was the source of their grumbling. Question number 4, how did Jesus answer their charges? It refers to verses 43 through 51. Just a moment. So, starting in verse 43, I had to give myself a throat lozenge there. Jesus said, stop grumbling among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Again, the question is, how did Jesus answer their charges? First, he tells them to stop grumbling. Verse 41 said, at what Jesus had said previously, the Jews began to grumble, complain, murmur about him because he said, I'm the bread that came down from heaven. This seems like an intentional use of the words used back in the books of Exodus and Numbers, where the people murmured and complained that caused God to give them the manna, and then later they murmured and complained about the manna. But Jesus points out that God draws people with teaching. He invites them to listen to and to accept his teachings, to feast on his words. Question number 5 says, why did the Jews quarrel among themselves? Verses 52 through 59. It says, then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. Of course, this is confusing language to them, especially those who are carnally minded. We'll get to that in just a second. The question is, why did the Jews quarrel among themselves? Well, it's because they came to Jesus with one thing in mind, and he's presenting something entirely different than what they were looking for. Jesus was not telling them to literally eat his flesh and drink his blood. He was telling them who he was, and he was telling them that they needed to believe in him. But that's not what they were interested in. They were interested in a free meal, or continuation of free meals. Notice verses 34 and 35. They said to him, Sir, always give us this bread. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Now notice, he says, whoever comes to me will never go hungry. In this instance, he clarified, he didn't say whoever eats my flesh will never go hungry. He said, whoever comes to me. And how do you come to him? In verses 44 and 45, by responding to the teaching. Father draws through the teaching, through the instruction. But anyway, verse 35 again, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never go thirsty. But as I told you before, you have seen me, and you still do not believe. So that verse is a key verse in understanding this text. Verse 35, it clarifies that coming to him and believing in him is the essence of his message. And by doing those two things, you will never go hungry and you'll never go thirsty. So him eating his flesh and drinking his blood, those statements there are not literal. They are figurative, and they serve their purpose by their response. Question number 6 says, why were so many people offended by Jesus? Chapter 6, verses 60 through 65. The text says, on hearing this, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. The question again was, why were so many people offended by Jesus? Well, again, they were offended because they had sought him out and they were following him for the wrong reason. He's not performing as they had hoped he would. They had such high hopes, but he's not meeting their expectations. Question 7 says, once offended, What did these people do? Verse 66 says, "From this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him." When we're trying to teach someone the gospel, sometimes people simply have no interest in spiritual things, and we need to be aware of that. As a result, we often make one of two mistakes when we don't keep that in mind. We either begin trying to pressure or placate the people who are really not interested in the gospel, or we think there's something wrong with us or something inadequate about our teaching. We need to remember John chapter 6 as we try to teach others the gospel. Not everyone will be interested in spiritual things. Question number 8 says, what did Jesus ask his disciples in verses 67 through 69? He said, "Do you want to go away as well?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." Notice that Jesus didn't try to talk people into things. Again, he didn't pressure people. He wasn't pushy. He simply taught the truth. Then he let people make their own decision. Question 9 says, what do we learn about the character of Judas in verses 70 and 71? It says, "Then Jesus replied, have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. Peter had just made a wonderful and powerful confession regarding Jesus, but Jesus throws some reality into the mix. He points out that one of the 12 is a traitor. He calls Judas a devil, a slanderer. Judas had taken on the qualities of the arch enemy of righteousness. Next week's assignment will be, let me see, get my PowerPoint up here so I can change it. By the way, okay. Section 4, the period of conflict, which covers chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 53, but we're only going to be looking at sections A, B, and C, which covers chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 11. So section 4, letters A, B, and C will be our class for next week.